Jerry's not here tonight.
Yeah, everybody feeling good?
Yeah, anybody passing out? Terry.
Check.
If you plan on passing out, you might want to sit a little closer.
Just like you to have a chance to work on your off time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I want you to keep your. Yeah, I know exactly what that's on.
His vitals
By the way, my dog just needs
Huh?
to have.
His vitals are good.
Yeah, I know.
I will you call him.
What he did.
He knows what he did.
Oh.
We've had this conversation.
Jerry gave me so much trouble on my list of the apostles. I literally had this one, and it was the one I had worked on, so that's my excuse, and I'm sticking with it.
Hold on.
But again, yeah, get a picture of the right one. Send it to Jerry just for a minute, please, and tell him he's not at church and we're talking about him. But the apostles is where we're starting, but we're going to be looking at other characters too. And Peter, we're spending a little more time on him than we would on others because he is more of a prominent figure. And so that's kind of where we are. Peter has become this person now to me. I won't ever be able to see him in my own mind without thinking that's what he looks like. But and I'm not helping myself with using him this way. Okay. Peter, from natural leader to spiritual leader. One of the things we've talked about a couple of times is that Peter seemed to have some pretty good qualities for leadership from the very beginning. That he had some assertiveness and things of that nature that really was something that could be used. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. Because he was, as we mentioned last week, the leader of the apostles. And Carl mentioned that he was the oldest, which might have played a lot of role in that. And then we also talked about that the idea of him having some of the qualities that he had. So I want to walk through some of that with a view toward watching how Jesus worked and what Jesus did. You all able to see that? And so first of all, we're going to see the three of those leadership thoughts, and really, he has the raw material to work with. He was one that seemed to, from the beginning, be able to fall back on. I know in preaching there are people who just have that flow, and you can't, and so they could be talking about anything, and if the sermon breaks down, they just start talking. You know, it's just kind of, and it's what they call it, motor mouth or something. You know, it's just a natural kind of thing, and you preachers can fall back on that. Well, I think about Peter, and I think about the different challenges he had. He had a past he could fall back on. He was a strong man. It appears from his work. He was in a lot of things. So the raw materials were there with him. We also find that he had the right life experiences, and these two are the way we're going to kind of try to get through tonight. And there'll be a third one. But he had the right kind of life experiences that would enable him to be a very effective leader, and especially doing what he did. He had the right character qualities. He appeared to be a guy that could be trusted, a guy that would work hard, a guy that, unless the Romans wanted more money than he had, he was honest. That, you know, he was just creative with explaining his situation with the Romans in the video. But as we look at this tonight, I want us to think about how it works with people in general. Just in going to a business, one of the things they want to know is whether you've had training, but also whether you've had the raw ability to do some things just from a personality standpoint. I know a young lady that went to an insurance company. She's going to be part of the call station, you know, taking care of problems and stuff when people call in. She's extremely passive, shy, squeaky little voice. Well, she didn't get the job, and I don't think she would if she went back 30 times. I really don't, because that's just not going to, you know, her personality is not going to work. But Peter was one that seemed to have. But at the same time, one of the things we're going to see is that Peter also needed Christ to shape him in those things. It's one thing to have some of the great qualities that he had, but really anything that is a good quality can become a negative if it's used in the wrong way. And so we'll watch and we'll try to get some ideas of how Jesus worked with him with that in mind. And so, the raw material of a leader. We're going to look at Romans chapter 12. We're going to just begin with these couple of passages here in the beginning, with a view toward trying to establish that God is involved. He was involved in bringing Peter into that circumstance. And to whatever degree we can get our mind around it, and not that God's limited to that, but when we think about our being here, we've often said, and I've often said, well, we're not here by accident. We're here because God has brought us. The Spirit of God has brought us together. And that was an intentional thing. I want to establish, or at least consider that as a principle. Hello, you principle, and consider that as a principle. Romans 12, it seems to be good for so many things, but when you get down to verse 6 and following, you watch and you see how the individuals that he's talking to as a part of what the Spirit is doing and how they have worked together. And so, according to the grace given to us, we have different gifts. And that's Paul speaking to the Christians. He calls it a grace, and he calls it that we've been given, or that they had been given, gifts. The term gifts will kind of be explained here. If prophecy, use it according to the proportion of one's faith. If the gift that you have is service, then use it in service. If teaching, in teaching. In exhorting, in your exhortation. If this gift that you have is giving, give with generosity. And here's the one in particular. If your gift is leading, of course, following, we're lead with diligence, showing mercy with cheerfulness. I don't know how closely God aligns us, but I can't help but believe that passages like this lead us to believe that he does align people in congregations and places. I give him, anytime there's a success, he was right in the middle of it and the cause of it. So it's hard to separate his working in general with just the world, but also his specific working with us. And this is kind of the sister passage of the Romans 12. A little more information here. And he's talking here about the church, but notice how he talks about the Spirit's involvement. Now, there are different gifts, which goes back to Romans 12, but the same Spirit. Okay, so he's talking about unity here especially. I mean, there may be different gifts. People may be able to do different things, but there's only one Spirit that we're all subject to, that we all go back to, so we're united. So he says, now there's different gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different ministries, but the same Lord. Again, we've got all these different things going, but we all are those who are working with the Lord. And there are different activities, but the same God works all of them in each person. So God's involved. The Spirit is involved. And then look at verse 7. A manifestation of the Spirit is given to each person for the common good. So that'd be that, here we come, we've got different people that have come together. But their abilities, their gifts, I call it everything that they've got, whether it's their training, whether it's a gift that God gave them specifically, whether it's a personality or whatever. It is a manifestation of the working of the Spirit of God, and it's given to each person for the common good. And so for me to say, well, I'm just not going to use my talent, is to say, I don't care about the church. It's a common good. I mean, that's where we are, where we need to feel a responsibility. 20 gives a message of wisdom through the Spirit. To another, a message of knowledge by the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. Again, notice these gifts. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. Here we're talking about miraculous gifts, of course, in that passage, or in that statement. To another, the performing of miracles, and to another, prophecy, and to another, distinguishing between spirits, to another, different kinds of tongues, to another, interpretation of tongues. One, the same Spirit is active in all these, distributing to each person as he wills. Now, tonight I want us to think of Peter along this line. I want to think of him as being one that was chosen and was prepared and was the things that he had learned as a kid and the things that he had become were things that God had brought to good use, that God had brought to a place where he could be so instrumental in the kingdom. And I don't think anybody had a greater impact on the kingdom than Peter did. Paul was right there next to him, which is kind of odd. I mean, there are a bunch of other apostles that are part of the 12, but we've got Peter being just really extremely involved. We look at Acts chapter 2, and I think again he was helped by the Spirit of God, but he taught the gospel basically from looking back to where God was preparing and brought it down to Christ. And he did so very, very effectively. So the principle, God brings people to circumstances. He qualifies them. He prepares them. And that's the principle of the passages we've looked at. I think it falls back down to us as well. The miraculous gifts and things of that nature, of course, we would argue about. But I'm thinking about those other ones that had nothing to do with what appeared to be a miraculous in that kind of being true to that term, miraculous. But there were some that were very much principles that you and I could receive as a gift ourselves. So let's look at, first of all, Peter had a curiosity, which was, I think, which is a good quality for a leader to have. And the statement, people who are content with what they don't know, happy to remain ignorant about what they don't understand, complacent about what they haven't analyzed, and comfortable living with problems they haven't solved, such people don't lead. Now, I'm not going to beat them up, but they probably won't make real good leaders because they've got to have more initiative, and well, that'll be actually the next one, but they've got to have more of I need to know, I need to understand place. In the Gospels, Peter asked more questions than all of the other apostles combined. Think about it. And it's just, and Peter probably has more things written to him and by him in the Gospels than the others as well. But what we do see a lot is him asking for a better understanding. It was usually Peter who would ask Jesus, as in Matthew 15 and verse 5, Peter said, "Explain this parable to us." He was the one that kind of took the lead and was out there. It was Peter who asked how often he needed to forgive. You remember he said 70 times 7? That's in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. It was Peter who asked what reward the disciples would get for having left everything to follow Jesus in Matthew 19, verse 27. It was Jesus who asked about the withered fig tree. The fig tree, it had withered. They had seen it earlier, and that's in Mark chapter 11, verse 21. It was Peter who asked of the risen Christ, questions of the risen Christ. And this was, of course, after he was raised. That's John chapter 21, 20 through 22. Peter always seemed to be wanting to understand. He wanted to be able to get his mind around a parable. And you and I both know sometimes those parables as to exactly how they apply can be difficult. And so this sort of inquisitiveness is really a basic element that he had. it made him someone that would be more anxious to learn as well as Jesus. He was teaching them, his peers, all the way, all the time. And so he would have been teacher's pet if it comes to just the matter of whether or not they wanted to learn. Now, he'd be the one that'd be shooting or spitballs probably at the teacher, but he was the one wanting to learn, so that would have been a good thing. We find also, and this was what I mentioned a minute ago, one of the raw materials that we find would have been worth considering would be the initiative that he took. The statement we have here, leaders will have drive, ambition, and energy and make things happen. He is a starter. Notice that Peter not only asked questions, he was also often the first one to answer any questions posed by Christ. He often charged right in where angels feared to tread, and got in trouble for it a few times too. So here we've got it. When Jesus asked, "Who do men say that I am?" in Matthew 16, which is a real prominent passage as we're talking about the rock, him being the rock, and Jesus saying, "Upon this rock I'll build my church." I mean, there's a passage that is very significant. Well, Peter was the one who ultimately responded with the facts. The others had said, well, maybe Elijah, one of the prophets, is who. But Peter said, no, you're the Son of God. You're Christ. You're Messiah. And so that was typical of Peter. In the Garden of Gethsemane, that's always an interesting event, always an interesting things that happened there. Jesus is in a frame of mind that he's preparing himself to go through some really hard times. We could debate a little bit on how much he really understood about what was to come. But if you look at some of the things he had taught and already told his apostles and disciples of what's going to happen when he went to Jerusalem, he was pretty well informed. The cross was coming. And it was going to be an extremely difficult thing for him to go through. And so in the Garden of Gethsemane, he goes and he tries to prepare. Now, there's another event that he's kind of famous for, and that is when they came to take Jesus, Peter decided to defend him. And of course, that seems to be something that came pretty natural to Peter. Matthew 26, verse 47, and Mark 14, Luke 22. Those are all toward the end of the Gospels, different Gospels. And I'll tell this story or what was done. There was likely, I see the number hundreds when I'm studying this. And I guess I just find it hard to think that you'd go after one guy with hundreds of men, Roman soldiers. But, the facts of what those kind of units would have been is that they would have been several, be 100 or so soldiers that would have gone. Maybe they had heard about the people, how they would get up in arms about Jesus, and they just wanted to make sure they were overwhelming as they went to gathering. Judas brought them there. Without hesitation, Peter pulled out his sword, and he took a swing at the head of Malchus. Now, most people think that the only reason he got his ear is because he ducked. He was shooting for his neck. And I guess Jesus could have put a neck back on or a head back on his body too. But here we've got a real challenge for us. Jesus, could he have walked away from that? I think he could. Did he have any angels that were anxious? Legions? I kind of have this image of the angelic world, and all of them are like this. They're just hoping he'll give them a good excuse. And but instead, Jesus said, "No, this is something I have to do," which is interesting and also very challenging as well. So Jesus touched his ear; he healed it. Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. And that's Matthew 26 and verse 52. Those characteristics, they're not only raw materials, but they are the needs that a person has. It's kind of the things that make a person who they are. Now, we're going to look at another one here in a sec, but I want to make the point that if you take just these two things, for example, and they're not trained, they become destructive. It's one thing to have an ability. It's another thing to have an ability that can be used in a way that is productive. The initiative, or taking initiative, that's all great and good, but that can also describe a snowplow, that takes the initiative and just plows right through, and people get hurt. And we've talked about that kind of thing in years gone by, just trying to see the nature of church and the nature of church family. Peter was pretty rugged as an individual, and yet Jesus was able to use all kinds of things in life and experiences, mistakes, and good things that he did to prepare him to be just such a power in building the kingdom of God, the church, from the ground up. Then there's the involvement. Obviously, Peter was great at doing what God had wanted him to do. Leaders are always in the middle of the action. They do not sit in the background telling everyone else what to do. A leader goes through life with a cloud of dust around them. That's why people follow. People cannot follow someone who remains distant. The leader must show the way. He goes before the followers into the battle. Peter would have been made A+ on that one. He was definitely one that would take the initiative, and he didn't really feel like he needed to wait on much of anyone to take the initiative. Jesus came to his disciples one night and out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee and was walking on the water, and you know the rest of the story. Peter, they all first saw him and said, well, that must be a ghost. I guess they believed in ghosts. But that must be a ghost. And Peter said, well, if it is you, then let me come to you. And Peter did. And remember, he began to sink as he began to look around. We often give him a hard time for having lost that vision or that faith. But you remember, the other guys are holding on to the side of the boat, trying not to fall out, and he's standing in the water. So I think he's to be commended. I think there's something about him that we see here in an impossible situation. Peter stepped out and became one who became a wonderful example of stepping out on faith, and there's been a lot of sermons preached about it. Similarly, although Peter denied Christ, you think back to John 18. When Peter denied Christ, denied knowing him. That's one of theirs. Oh, no, it's not. And he got pretty graphic in his language. It was one of those things he would want to make sure they understood. I don't know this guy. But he was there. The only other one that may have been there would have been John. I think it was probably John, the disciple that Jesus loved, I think was John. And so he was there. He was wanting to be told. The other guys were hiding. And so here we've got Peter looking. He wanted to understand or know what was happening, while at the same time, when he came right down to it, he faltered in his faith and in his strength. I know we've never done that. We want so badly to get and to be the one that does the right, and yet the challenges are so real. Before going any farther, into kind of the next thought. And so we've got these gifts. We've got these raw material abilities that Peter had. One of the things we're also going, well, let me ask you this. why was Jesus able to use him and shape him? What was there about Peter that allowed him to be available, if you will, to grow, to know how to use, for God to have been able to shape him? What else was in Peter?
Being available and willing is the first steps.
Yeah, and that availability and willingness was without excuse, without limit. Ultimately, he said, Lord, and I think he meant he would die for Christ, but
I think he's got a lot of loyalty.
yeah, very loyal.
That sword shows loyalty.
Yeah, once he hooked on, once he really faith became true to him, Jesus became obvious to him. He held on well, and again with a faith that was able to make mistakes and come back, able to create even issues and problems, but come back and be used. So Peter, what are some other things that you remember in Peter's life that you think are evidence of his ability or of his use of those gifts and talents? We mentioned Acts 2, where he preached the first sermon in the church, and how that there were thousands that were ultimately reached through the message. There are, I'm sure, other reasons that were involved with that. What are the things about Peter? We talked about him as a primary apostle, but was he ever a humble apostle? What about the sons of thunder were ready to take the pick of the right and left sides of Jesus? I mean, they were even their mama was after him. I mentioned that before. But what do you think of Peter as the one that seemed to be the one that Jesus leaned on? You think of 1st and 2nd Peter in his writings. Peter was a strong leader after their resurrection, for sure. He was building up the church and the people in the church for a time of persecution in 1st and 2nd Peter. A time when he said, listen, it's tough now, but it's going to get worse. And he called them to stability and strength and wholeness. With Peter. Any other things? Go, Jim.
Wasn't Peter the one that got the sign that it was okay to eat all those unclean things? And probably anybody else wouldn't have had the force to go forward and enforce that.
Yeah. Yeah, Cornelius, when he was with Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, he was convinced. I mean, it was a hard convince, but he was convinced that the gospel's for everybody. The gospel's, even eating catfish, was doing all right for him. I want us to look now at what I think may be some of the more important, not more, but more interesting things as we think about what Jesus was doing in the life that Peter had, what I was working with him. And the idea is Peter, his life experiences that shaped him as a leader. How did the Lord take a man cut from such a rough fabric and refine him into a leader? Didn't mean he weakened him at all, but it turned him into a leader of people, a group of people that can, and was able to work with people, still strong. I don't see him becoming weak. For one thing, he made sure Peter had the kind of life experiences that formed him into the kind of leader that Christ wanted him to be. And it is in this sense that true leaders are made, not just born. So the things you're born with, of course, there are leadership qualities. And the process of growing to use those is really, really significant. Let's look at a couple of things in relationship to that. Trying to not go through everything. Peter had a lot of ups and downs. There were times when he was a guy that everybody was excited about. Other times everybody there was other times when it was very painful, the things that he went through. The Lord dragged him through 3 years of tough ministry. He kind of stepped back and let Peter make his mistakes. He gave Peter the kind of enough rope to hang himself a few times, but it was all a part of preparing him. Everything he was taught by word, everything concerning the Scripture and the Old Testament and the applications of to Jesus and all those things were important and were a part of it. But also, as he works with Peter and the experiences that he had, the Apostle Peter learned a lot of hard things. He learned that the crushing defeat of deep humiliation often follow hard on the heels of our greatest victory. Now, here's an example of that. You get so high, before you turn around, you get hit again. Excuse me. Just after Christ had commended him for the great confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," in Matthew chapter 16. In verse 16, Peter suffered the harshest rebuke ever recorded by a disciple in the New Testament. One moment, Peter is being blessed. In other moments, he's being called Satan. Sorry. "Get behind me, Satan. You are offensive to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." How can you go so far? Or maybe it's not so far. What do you think, Peter, what do you think was the thing about what was happening that led Christ to make such a strong point? Jesus was busy doing his stuff. And Peter was afraid for him. And so Peter becomes Satan to him. You think maybe Jesus considered him to be, maybe Jesus had already been tempted to not go, not be persecuted. And here Peter comes along trying to give aid to that. Whatever it was, he was trying to stop Christ. And Jesus had told them, what I'm doing is necessary. Where I'm going and what will happen to me there, all that's necessary. It's going to have to happen for the good of the kingdom. Peter fell victim to Satan again on the night that Jesus was arrested. And that's the story about cutting of the ear. But it's also when Peter learned how much weakness he actually had. Peter, I think, believed with all my heart. I think he believed he would die for Christ, and that was really his conviction. But when it came down to it, he became very protective of himself. Have you ever learned those kind of lessons? You thought you were I thought I was bigger than that. I thought my faith was stronger than that. When we look back, I think that's a lesson that Peter learned. The confidence of faith, the confidence of I'll be faithful, isn't necessarily made because we are just strong-willed. It's the result of the working of God in our life, the Spirit in our life, and the working of Christ in our life. He also learned, though, that in spite of those spiritual weaknesses, God didn't give up on him. I mean, let's take a trip through the Gospels, just and let Peter write down all the blunders, the things that he had done. There were a lot of wonderful things, but let's consider the down times. And Peter could look at that and he could understand that he was pretty ordinary, and yet God continued to call him. God continued to bring him in. God continued to use him. he was not going to give up on Peter. Peter was an instrument. God's not going to give up on us. God's not going to give up on us because we've made some blunders. In fact, you can guarantee you're going to make some blunders. I mean, that's just part of the process of our growth as well. But he doesn't desert us. He continues to come. I keep thinking about Mark's gospel when he talks about Jesus after the resurrection called the disciples to come, and he said, and Peter, as designating him. Remember that? Max Lucado pointed that out years ago, and probably no wonder they call him Savior, one of those books. And the idea was that he'd called the bunch, but then he specifically mentioned Peter, and this was after he had denied him. And I think that's just the way God is. He doesn't want us to ever be at a point where we feel like we've got to quit or give up. He wants us to always know that there's forgiveness, there's mercy, there's rebirth in essence, or there's renewal in life. Peter learned by his experiences. Sometimes the experiences were bitter, distressing, and humiliating. Other times they were encouraging and uplifting, such as when Peter saw Christ's divine brilliance on the Mount of Transfiguration. Who went up there with him? Peter, James, and John. And we talked about this first week, that there's sometimes they're just kind of picked out and they go. But can you imagine having been there and seeing Jesus glow in this light as bright as the sun? I mean, Peter was a part of that. Peter was molded by his experiences, gleaning from the lessons that he had learned. I think probably all the apostles did that. I think Peter is more pronounced simply because we have more information about him. As we've said, we don't have a lot of information about many of these guys. And if we did, I think what we would find is some pretty incredible guys doing the work of the kingdom. Judas, as an exception, he just didn't seem to get it back together. So, what do you think as we move away from Peter? Where do you want to go next? Let's go to Jezebel. Jezebel. Now we'll stay with the apostles, but I think that if nothing else, I want us to become people who say, that's kind of like me. When we see them, they're not superhuman. They don't come with some kind of extra knowledge. Not that God wouldn't bless them with knowledge or use the Spirit to give them knowledge, but they come like us. They come with a faith that says, I just really want to do this well. And yet at the same time, finding that we don't always make the grade. But in not making the grade does not mean that we've been so totally defeated. And so when we get through with the apostles, we'll move into some of the women that worked with Christ, worked with Paul, and worked with Peter, and some of the others mentioned in the epistles, because I think we've kind of missed that. But I want us to get through. We'll find ourselves looking at 2 or 3 different apostles some nights, because there's just that little information about them. And so this study will move pretty quickly as we move on. Any questions or thoughts or answers or corrections?
I was just thinking that you mentioned curiosity before we started. And I think Peter had a lot of that. And I think at the same time he was receptive to the information that he was receiving. Stop and think about it, he was slightly more than 20 years old. Mm-hmm. And a lot to learn.
Yeah, these guys were young guys. And Peter most likely was the oldest of the bunch. Yeah. And so he was at least close to that. And so you've got a young group of guys that Jesus was able to work with and had great energy. And there was wisdom in choosing the younger, because the work that they would do would go on for years after that. I encourage you to read the book of Acts with the apostles in mind, and how their story fits in and into that history of the church's beginning and its spreading, and how the apostles were such at the heart of that, because there were a lot of heroic things that were done by these men in building the kingdom in the churches, in the early years of the church. Brother Buck, keep praying for Brother Buck. For those who may not know, Brother Buck has been, he's one of our elderly saints, but he has been a backbone. I mean, just a real backbone and of the church here. And so he